Hey, welcome. We're going to talk about today the sampler settings in patterning 3. Each of the 8 tracks in patterning can either have a sampler instrument or a MIDI instrument. And we'll talk about the MIDI instruments, the instrument settings, in another video over here somewhere. There'll be a link when it exists. But today we'll just talk about the sampler. We are on the main pattern page and we're in the sample window. So sample page is this waveform button. You can tap on it to go through the 3 pages of the sampler settings. And at the top, you'll see the sample for the current track. So I can change between my tracks and look at the different samples there. By tapping on the sample, you'll bring up the sampler, the sample library, and you'll see all of the samples that are on your device. The Patterning 3 samples folder, that is where all of the samples that you've downloaded through CloudKit. So if you've downloaded kits through the app, they'll show up there. So that's just like a location in files. If you are on files and you go to On My iPad, Patterning 3 samples, all of the samples that you've downloaded show up there. So this is great. If you just wanted to like drag your whole sample library into this samples folder, they will show up to patterning. But you'll see that the ones we've downloaded are organized by drum kit. So that is a pro tip for importing your sample library. But in addition to those sample location for the downloaded ones, you can also set folders like elsewhere on your device. So these are kind of favorite folders that are located elsewhere. You'll notice that this one, a bunch of these files are actually on the cloud. They're on my Dropbox. So I actually have to download them first. And I think, yeah, there it goes. It downloaded it. So these are, places that we can also add samples from. Great. So we can choose a sample here. The samples folder is searchable. So if I'm looking for like a kick drum sound, just kind of look through and find a drum that I like, maybe this one. We can also turn on the preview button if we want to hear the samples while we're selecting them in the browser. The other thing about the sample library here is that at the top you have the sample view and you can crop the sound, choose the start and end point. So this sound, that doesn't really matter, but if you had something longer, like maybe not that. Let me see if I can find something with a bunch of different sounds inside of it. Here's a good one. So you can see that this sample has kind of a longer section to it. And maybe I do want this, but maybe I really just want this part of it. You can set the start and end there. And if I wanted to actually then make this into a separate sample that was cropped, so I wanted to make this into individual samples, I can hit this little drop-down menu and hit crop, and it'll make a crop, and I can name that, and it'll crop it for me. So there's my cropped version. Any questions? Leave them in the comments. Well, 2 things I forgot to mention. One is that these favorites folders, we can add to them. Just you hit add folder, and then just on your iPad or wherever you can find, let's say maybe, does Koala have samples with it? This Koala default sampler folder, if I open that, it'll add that sampler folder to my favorites. And now I can access those. So that's nice if you don't want to be moving things around. The other thing I should say is that the drop-down menu in the samples folder, you can choose open to just open a sample, like a one-off sample from any place on your iPad, or import if you actually want to copy stuff into your samples folder. All right, let's look at all the sampler playback controls. So I can close this sample library just by hitting this X right here, or just by tapping on the waveform view there. All right, so we've chosen a sample, and now let's look at the rest of the controls on this main sample page. So the first 3 controls are for the volume envelope. So if you're not familiar with a volume envelope, it's basically a function that is used to fade in and out a sound. The three parameters are the attack time, the hold percentage, and the decay time. So the attack time is the amount of time it takes for the sound to fade in at the beginning of the sound. So let me just solo this track so we can hear it. I'll hold down Alt and solo this kick drum sound. So you can hear the sound. If I turn the attack up, it's gonna fade in the beginning of the sound, and it kind of cuts off the transient at the beginning. It makes the sound a lot softer. The hold is going to determine at what percentage of the sample does the decay or the fade out begin. So if I took the hold all the way down to like here, 9.7%, you can see where the fade in starts there, and then I can use the decay to set the fade out time. And what I like to do is set the hold to all the way off and the decay to kind of short, so we get this really kind of short thing. And then I can either record changes in the decay or draw them in. So let's just do record. I'll hit record. And so we get kind of a variation on that. I can also just hold down decay and draw in which steps I want to be longer. This is when I hold down on the parameter, it's just going to show me the automation for that parameter. And I can make some of the steps have a longer decay. There's a whole other video about automation and how we work with layers, and that will be in the description or up here in the sky. It's over here. Okay. So below the envelope section is our tuning section. And this is where we control the playback speed of our sample. So I've got a pitched sound, and this works with sounds that aren't pitched as well, but it's easier to kind of hear it with a pitched sound. So our coarse tuning is in semitones, and the fine tuning is in cents. A cent is 1/100th of a semitone. So we can play around with these. So the coarse tuning is going to set it in semitones and the fine tuning in cents. And just like with the other controls, if we hold down on the parameter, we can tune individual steps. And one thing that's great, sort of one of the deeper kind of pro tips that you might not know about, is that we can set this coarse tuning to snap to certain intervals. So by default, it's going to go plus or minus 24 semitones, which is 2 octaves. But if I hold down Alt, and you can latch the Alt on by just dragging off the Alt key before letting go of it, you'll see a quantized keyboard down here in the bottom right. This is showing us which intervals we can snap the coarse tuning parameter to. So for example, if I wanted to have it snap to intervals of the major scale, I could just turn off all the white keys. And now it'll only allow me to play notes in the major scale. We could try maybe outline a chord, a major 7th chord, or a minor 7th chord. One thing that's cool about this quantizing is that it works also if you're using modulation and automation. Let me clear that automation. I'll hit the eraser tool and just hit the X here to clear all that automation. Put this back at 0. If I turn on Alt and go to random and I just turn up the randomization, we'll get a randomized melody using just these intervals. So now all the coarse tuning randomization is snapping to those intervals. One thing to keep in mind with a sampler is we're importing a sample and we don't know necessarily what the pitch of that sample is. It could be a C, it could be an A that's 14 cents flat or whatever. And if you want the tone, the sound to kind of be in tune with a specific piece of music, you might want to tune that sound correctly. So one thing that I often do is I'll just pull out a tuner, and if it says, it's an F and it's 32 cents flat, I'll just take the fine tuning here and go 32 cents sharp to compensate for that, and now it's a proper F. And if I then want it to be a C, I would coarse tune it down by 5 semitones to make that F into a C. So you can use these coarse tune and fine tune to tune something to a specific note. And I just literally pull out a tuner on my phone and use that to figure it out. And that kind of plays into this idea that when we're using this quantized keyboard here, what this is quantizing is intervals. So it's not, if your note is C, then this will correspond to the notes you're hearing out of the quantizer. But if your note is an F, then it'll be intervals from the note F, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. So we have our envelope settings, our tuning settings, and then this next section here is for the trigger. So these are some sort of advanced, for all you advanced electronic musicians out there who want advanced tools. This trigger section has this choke group and the polyphony control. So a choke group, the typical use for it is that like a hi-hat sound. You have an open hi-hat sound and a closed hi-hat sound. And if you're trying to make like a realistic hi-hat, you don't want both of those samples playing at the same time. You play the open hi-hat, and if the closed hi-hat comes on the next beat, you want it to turn the open hi-hat sound off so it sounds like they're connected to each other. So by putting two sounds in a choke group, you're making it so only one of them can be playing at a time. So here's our open hi-hat. And I'm gonna go back here. I'll put this in choke group 1, and then I'll put my closed hi-hat in choke group 1 also. So if you hear that on that first beat, the open hi-hat plays, and then as soon as this closed hi-hat plays next, it turns the open hi-hat off. And you can hear how the second one rings out because it doesn't have a closed hi-hat after it. So yeah, that's how the choke groups work. There's two different choke groups. So if you had two different sets of sounds that you wanted to have in the same choke group, you can do that. The next setting is the polyphony, and that's related. Well, it's similar. It's not necessarily related, but it's basically for each individual note or each individual sample, can more than one of that sample play at a time. It's almost like a choke group within the individual sample. So, okay. Yeah, this will demonstrate the idea well. So with polyphony on, you get multiple copies of that like rising synth sound. When I turn on mono mode, it cuts off the sound at each new retrigger. So mono and poly. So this is really only useful if you have sort of longer samples and you want them to either overlap or not. Cool. That's the trigger section of the sampler. I should also point out now before we move on to the next pages that the bottom of all the sampler pages have a solo and a mute. So there's solo and mute. So what solo will do, if you're not familiar with that concept, solo will turn this track on and turn everything else off, so you can just identify that track on its own. Whereas mute will turn this current track off and allow everything else to play. There's another shortcut for soloing and muting, which is just to hold down the Alt key, and you get the solos and mutes for each of your tracks over there on the left side. So that's our sample page. The next page of the sampler is the mix page. So I can tap on the mix tab. You can also cycle through the different pages by just tapping on the sample icon. There's basically there's three sections actually. Three sections. There's the filter section, where we can add a filter to the sound. There's the effects send, and then there's panning. So the filter section has a simple filter. It can either be bypass, which means the filter's off, or you can set it to low pass, band pass, or high pass. So these are the three different modes. And you can also, no matter what mode you're in, you can just use the filter graph to change the filter frequency and resonance. So filter frequency is going to be left and right, and resonance will be up and down. For the filters, so our first filter is a low pass filter. What that means is it allows low frequencies to pass through and cuts off the high frequencies. So this graph is showing us you can think of this as a graph of low frequency to high frequency from left to right. And then up and down is the amplitude, the change in amplitude of that frequency. So with a low pass filter, you can see that these low frequencies get through and the high frequencies are cut off. So if I play this, we can kind of cut off those high frequencies or allow them through. And these filters also have resonance. So if you go up and down, it'll add a resonant peak to the filter, which means that at the cutoff frequency of the filter, the frequency at which the filter is working, you'll add a kind of resonance or a emphasis on that frequency. So you kind of, I think of it as just like you hear the you hear the filter doing its work more. And this will be really apparent when I bring it up. So the filter kind of imparts, when the filter is resonant, it kind of imparts its own tone onto the sound. So that can be useful depending on what kind of music you're making. So this is our low pass filter. Our band pass. A band pass is going to allow a certain band of frequencies through, and it's going to cut everything above and below that out. So just like the low pass, I can control which frequency. And in this case, it's not so much resonance as just kind of the cue or shape of the band. So you can see as I pull down, it gets wider and it's going to let more frequencies through. And as I pull up, it gets narrower. And then lastly, we have the high pass, which is going to let high frequencies pass through and cut out low frequencies. High pass and low cut are the same thing. They mean the same thing. And then low pass and high cut are the same thing. So this is really nice. If you have a sound maybe that you aren't using as like a kick drum or a bass sound, but it has some low frequency information in it, a lot of times you'll use a high pass to kind of cut those low frequencies out that aren't really necessary. You can also just use this to make kind of a thinner sound if you like. That's our filter section. I think I'm ready to move on to the next part of the interface, which is our sends. In another video, I talk about the effects, the delay and the reverb, but this is where we can send individual tracks over to those effects. So we have our delay send and our reverb send. So let me just type in actually, let me use a different sound here. Let's go to a snare track. So I have a snare. So the delay send will send our sample over to the delay. And we can just determine how much of the sample is sent over there. And likewise, the reverb send determines how much this sample is sent to the reverb. Pretty straightforward. The last section of this mix page is our panning. So this is just setting the stereo field of our sample. So we can either set it to the center or we can send it over to the left or right speakers. I'm a big fan of like hi-hats and just kind of like randomly panning things. And I've referenced this a couple times now, but you know, the modulation stuff that we can do in the app. So I like to take the randomizer and just put it on panning. We get kind of like a fun stereo field. So that's the mix page. We've also got our solo and mute on that page. And then our last page of the sampler is our ring mod and distortion page. So this is sort of about adding some texture, grit to your sounds. The top section is a simple ring modulator. A ring modulator is an effect. It's super simple. It's literally you take a sine wave in this case, or some kind of waveform, and you multiply it by the incoming sound. And based on what those two sounds are, in the case of a sine wave and a sample, it's gonna make the sound have like a metallic quality to it. If your ring mod is two sine waves mashing up against each other, you get sort of a predictable kind of 2 or 3 tone sound, metallic sound. But with a sample where you have like a lot of different frequencies interacting with that sine wave, you'll get kind of metallic and interesting sounds. Let me try do this with a some kind of pitched sound. Oh, I don't want that one. No. Sure. No, I don't want that. Okay. So this is just the note C. Okay. So the ring mod section has a mix where you can mix between the dry and the entirely ring modded signal. So you can mix between the dry and the wet. I'll just put it 100% wet. And then our ring mod frequency will set the frequency of the sine wave that we're multiplying by our original signal. So you can hear it's just kind of adding different overtones to the sound, adding new frequencies, and it makes it kind of a metallic sound. This is cool. I mean, it's cool with a lot of different types of sounds. I mean, with something like a snare, it's going to be a pretty different effect. There's some fun things that we can do with this. One thing I might like to do is just kind of put this all the way wet, find an interesting frequency, and then put the mix way down to just a little bit. So we're just kind of mixing in that effect with the original. And it's just kind of a fun little extra layer of sound that we can put on our samples. The last section of this page is the distortion section. So this whole bottom part, and this is a wave shaping saturator distortion, and it basically will take your incoming signal and put it through a wave shaper to add harmonics. You can use this in subtle ways just to kind of make a sound pop out a little bit, add some harmonics, or you can like pretty much mangle the sound pretty severely. So the first control here is wet dry. So that's a mix between the unaffected signal, and 100% is going to be the totally distorted signal. Let's start with that. The controls here are for overdrive, and you can see the shape of the curve it's using. So basically, you can think of this as a graph, and it's basically going to shape the amplitude of the signal based on this curve, and so it's going to make everything louder, and then the louder parts of the sample are going to get clipped, and that ends up adding harmonics. So overdrive. Is basically the basic distortion setting. And then asymmetry, you can see, also changes the shape of this this wave shaper in a different way. So the other section of this distortion is that before, I should consult my manual, it's a filter. So we have a bandpass filter that you can see I can set the filter frequency and resonance of. And this is going to be a filter on our distortion. So this is nice especially with the wet dry, because we can do something like add some distortion, select a kind of specific band of the frequency that we like, and then use the wet dry to kind of mix that back in. So let me go to like our kick drum. Okay, so this is dry. Let's go add some distortion. You can really hear that kind of all those harmonics that it's adding. Let's add some asymmetry. That can be a little subtle, but it does make a difference. And then I can move the frequency around. So now the sound is pretty small now, but we're focusing in on this kind of clicky part of the sound. And now I can use wet dry and go back and just mix that clickiness in a little bit with my original sound. So original sound, distorted sound, and then somewhere in between. So we can kind of use the wet dry to mix in this distortion with the original sound. The last thing I kind of wanted to show is just the mixer page. So I pointed out that we have the solo and mute and the track volume on each of these pages, but there's also a mixer page, which is on the top, one of our 5 main pages. And this is just an overview of the current mixer settings. So we can set our individual volumes, we can solo and mute things. Oh, there's nothing on that track. So we have our individual volumes, mute and solo, and then we also have access to the reverb, delay, and panning. So all of the, this is sort of a quick view for some of those settings, particularly the mix page on our sampler settings. I think that's it for the sampler and patterning. And if you have any questions, let me know. Drop them in the comments, and I will write back to you. Okay, happy patterning.